Doing well this week. We are continuing our conversations on race and ethnic inequality. I'm really looking forward to grading the forums that you all did last week. I typically start to take a look at those on Monday, and so I'm very curious, eager to find out what you all thought about the material from last week, and especially the reading that you had from the supplemental reader, the Job Ghetto, because I think it does a really good job at kind of illustrating how race or racism kind of unfolds at the structural level. Okay, so I'm going to get right to it. Last week we learned about what it means to think about racism from a sociological perspective. We spoke of it as a systematic disadvantaging of people of color, and conversely, a systematic advantaging of the dominant racial group, which would be whites in American society. Now, that definition of racism tends to be quite different than kind of what most people think of when you say the word racist. Typically, when you talk about racism when you talk about racism, what comes to most people's minds are racist individuals, bigots who hold prejudice and or engage in discriminatory practices against people based on their racial groupings. And while there are certainly those individuals in our society that are openly racist and that hold prejudicial views against racial groups, sociologists tend to approach this concept of racism in a vastly different way. We look more at the processes in our society and the belief systems that support them, and thinking about the systematic disadvantaging and systematic advantaging. Now, that's not to say that individuals aren't a part of how this unfolds. I'm going to detail some of the processes and the belief system that I'm referring to in just a moment. Individuals are very much a part of these mechanisms, but the way our society is structured today in terms of race is that racism tends to be much more covert, much more hidden, much more subtle, and in a lot of ways just unconscious. It kind of operates in this deeply rooted place in our mind that people aren't always cognitively aware of. Which is different than kind of the explicit racism that we saw during the era of Jim Crow segregation, for example. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into talking a little bit about a few of these processes that explain differences between racial groups. And I guess I should back up for just a moment here. Last week, one of the readings you all had, it was a bunch of data presented by Arthur called Just the Numbers, and it gave you a sense of kind of where racial groups stand in American society on a variety of measures, on a variety of indicators of success in life. And as you saw, there were these vast differences between racial groups, whereby whites and Asians tend to fare better than do African Americans and Latinos. So I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about how we can think about those differences from a sociological perspective. What's going on here? So first, I'm going to start with racially homogeneous networks. So that's a really jargony way to talk about kind of the networks that we surround ourselves with, our friends and our families. The people that we come in contact with tend to be very racially homogeneous. Whites tend to congregate with whites, blacks congregate with blacks, Latinos with Latinos, Asians with Asians, and on and on. And so there's a lot of segregation when we think about our peer and our professional networks. Now, the thing about it, though, is that those networks that are predominantly white tend to have more resources at their disposal than do other networks. And a lot of that has to do with the historical legacy that I'll address in just a few moments. So we know these networks can help or hurt us in a variety of ways. Having a network that is resource rich can help you navigate the educational system. These networks can put you in contact with financial lenders. They can tell you about job openings or maybe even put in a good word for you. And so again, whenever we have these networks that are so that are so racially segregated, and white networks have more resources at their disposal, then that's going to go a long way in reproducing racial inequality, where whites are extending these resources to other whites rather than to members of other racial groups. And there's actually a really fascinating piece of research by Deirdre Worcester. It's a book titled Race and the Invisible Hand. And this is pretty much what she found. She studied a high school setting. She found that white networks were much more likely to provide aid for employment for white youths as compared to black students. And this is even coming from the same socioeconomic background in the same high school. So our networks, the networks that we're surrounded by, are important in thinking about how racial inequality perpetuates, or how it's maintained in American society. Another thing to consider is the wealth gap. Wealth is really important in life because it provides a nice safety net. So we have income that's kind of the paycheck we get weekly or biweekly or maybe even once a month. Income tends to be doled out very quickly. We spend it paying bills on rent and electricity, our discretionary income for entertainment, things of that nature. But wealth is more about what we have to rely on when things don't go so well in life, which happens to everybody at some point or another. Now, for many years, our government prohibited the accumulation of wealth for minority groups. And this is even as late as the 1960s. There were laws that allowed realtors and banks to discriminate against people of color in the housing market. This was called the practice of redlining. Some of you may be familiar with it. Now, that particular practice is important to note because most Americans' wealth is in the form of home equity. And so all the way up until 1960s, which was just a few decades ago when you think about the grand scheme of things, people of color were openly and legally discriminated against by realtors and lending agencies, prohibiting them from having the same type of access to the housing market that whites have had for the duration of America's history. And so again, going back to the point that most Americans' wealth is in the form of home equity, we can begin to see why people of color, and specifically African Americans and Latinos, would have less wealth as compared to whites. And those statistics are pretty staggering. Another thing to consider in terms of the maintenance of racial inequality, how we can explain differences in outcomes between racial groups, has to do with racial residential segregation. So much like with our peer and professional networks, our neighborhoods remain quite segregated. And what we find, what research indicates, is that neighborhoods with larger minority populations have fewer resources at their disposal as compared to neighborhoods that are either racially mixed, which are few and far between, or predominantly white. And our cities, something that I think students aren't always that aware of, our cities today, our cities and our towns today are more segregated than they were before the civil rights era. So we like to think that we had the civil rights movement, and it was an extremely important social movement that resulted in a lot of meaningful change. But in a lot of ways, we've not made nearly as much progress as people kind of think that movement has led to. I'm going to provide a link to a graph that I want to make sure that you take a look at that illustrates one of the significant consequences associated with racial residential segregation. What you'll see in this graph is that neighborhoods with higher concentrations of people of color tend to bear the brunt of environmental degradation more so than neighborhoods that are predominantly white. So this is a very clear illustration of kind of a consequence associated with racial residential segregation. It's not just that whites live with whites and blacks live with blacks and Latinos live with Latinos. It's that the neighborhoods where each of these racial groups concentrate have different resources at their disposal, and that's going to go a long way in perpetuating racial inequality. So I am going to stop here and start another video. I have found through trial and error that the shorter the clips, the easier it is to upload. So I'm signing off now, but I'm going to pick right back up where I'm leaving off in the part 2 of this video.